Hey guys, my name is Khalil Dosso. I'm doing this video to talk about what I think is probably going to become more than a crisis. More than an epidemic, I'm talking about the rise in homelessness. Homelessness is all around us. You see it in the subways. But before I get deeper, let me just say that the Department of Homeless Services does not release detailed information on why New Yorkers are applying for shelters, making it difficult to pinpoint the reasons behind the high numbers. The shelter population started to decline after the peak of the financial crisis, but started swelling again in 2008 and has not stopped growing ever since. So you see homelessness in the subway? You see homelessness in the streets? Then you see homelessness in a shelter. But to truly understand the current crisisness in homelessness, you have to understand how we got here. There are several critical points in history that led us to this point we are in right now. One initial catalyst was the Great Depression. The Great Depression of the 1930s affected virtually every New Yorker. Middle classes were forced to live paycheck to paycheck. Working class families struggled to find work and pay the bills, and the already poor often fell into destitution and homelessness. Historical stock charts seem to show that it took more than 25 years for the markets to recover from the 1929 crash. The Great Depression began with the stock market crash of 1929 and was made worse by the 1930s Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was a period of severe dust storms that greatly damaged the ecology and agriculture of the American and Canadian prairies. During the 1930s, sections of the Great Plains of the United States that extended over southeastern Colorado, southwestern Kansas, the panhandles of Texas, Oklahoma, and northeastern New Mexico suffered severe droughts. The droughts came in waves, 1934, 1936, and from 1939 to 1940. The Dust Bowl intensified the crushing economic impacts of the Great Depression and drove many families on desperate migrations in search of work and a better living. The Great Depression affected New York like it did the rest of the nation. Many families became homeless, living in shanty towns or in an expanding number of shelters and hotels. Many parents, while attempting to get back on their feet, sent their children to live with others. In December of 1934, more than 23,000 children were institutionalized or went to foster care homes. According to the New York Times, in the winter of 1931, 1.2 million Americans were homeless. This is a picture of New Yorkers building makeshift homes in Central Park in the 1930s. All right, y'all, just giving you some more information. Homeless people in large cities began to build their own homes out of found materials, and some even build more permanent structures from bricks. Small shanty towns, later named Hoovervilles, after President Hoover began to spring up in vacant lots, public land, and empty alleys. 3 of these pop-up villages were located in New York City, the largest of which was on what is now Central Park's Great Lawn. All right, let's get a little bit more deeper into the Great Depression. When the Great Depression set in, demands grew. As the demands grew, the overflow became far too overwhelming and unmanageable for government industry resources to manage. The initial response to the widespread unemployment came from private organizations, but soon the private organizations was overwhelmed. They only helped out a small percentage of people that was out of work. President Franklin Roosevelt came up with a plan called the New Deal Plan. The New Deal Plan set up safeguards so that the financial industries wouldn't crash like it did in 1929. The New Deal also set up Social Security programs and federal regulations imposed on the financial industries. And it also sparked a huge labor movement which fostered wage growth and to sustain the purchasing power of millions of Americans. It basically was the framework of creating a safety net so that the Great Depression won't happen again. But it did not slow down the rise of homelessness in the United States. Fiola LaGuardia became the face of the fight against the Depression in New York City, a reform-minded Republican who took office as mayor in 1934. LaGuardia closely tied the city's recovery to federally funded projects aimed at both putting people back to work and raising the quality of life in the city. Projects such as creating new parks and improving transportation. LaGuardia also dedicated his administration to bettering the conditions of housing for the poor throughout. The building of the first public housing in the city was thanks to him. The Great Depression finally came to an end in 1943. The Great Depression had finally come to an end in the city. The New Deal can't take all the credit. Other factors was also at play, including the onset of a major world war. It really could be argued World War II, which ultimately lowered unemployment, increased GNP through weapons production, really played a much bigger role. After the Great Depression, I want to talk about 5 critical factors that contributed to the rise of homelessness. And then I want to talk about a huge legal case that changed how society viewed homelessness. 1, urban renewal and deregulation of rent control / the Eurostat law. 2, the deindustrialization of New York City. 3, the deinstitutionalization of the state medical clinics. 4, the Callahan legacy, Callahan versus Carey, and the legal rights to shelter. Alright, y'all, let me try to give you a little more. As New York and the nations recovered from the Depression, the city continued efforts to brighten the urban environment through a formal program of renewal. These programs beautified the city, but they displaced large numbers of poor families. Among the affluents for most of the 1950s, many families who had known hardship during the Depression found new prosperity. But those who continued to struggle seemed forgotten as the city instituted restrictive policies, including rules that kept the poorest families out of the public housing. Urban renewal is the process of seizing and demolishing large swaths of private and public property for the purpose of modernizing and improving aging infrastructure. Between 1949 and 1974, the U.S. government underwrote this process through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, HUB, grant and loan program. redevelopment of large sections of New York City and New York State by Robert Moses between the 1930s and the 1970s was a noble and prominent example of urban redevelopment. Moses directed the construction of new bridges, highways, housing projects, and public parks. Alright, y'all want to hear a little bit more? I'm going to let y'all hear it. The state law, which then governs Nelson Rockefeller, pushed through in 1971, which Governor George Pataki strengthened in 2003, is named after Rockefeller's housing commissioner, Charles Eurostat. In 1971, the Eurostat law gave Albany power over New York City's rent regulations regime by forbidding any locality from enacting a stricter form of rent control than they imposed by the state. Over 150,000 units left rent regulation from 1990 to 2019 under the rule, which was replaced last year. For more than 3 decades, it has effectively handcuffed the city when it comes to dealing with main problems facing housing, rent, and eviction. Repealing the Eurostat law would give the city the power to keep rent affordable. So you see, urban renewal and the city's inability to govern or regulate the rent is having a huge impact on the displacement of homeless people throughout the city. If the city can't come up with a strategy to take care of their backyard, it leaves them it makes their life very difficult. Alright, y'all. Charles Eurostat curse on New York City tenants did not stop with the 1971 law, which bear his name. A major real estate owner, he was one of the architects of Governor George Pataki's 1994 transition platform, which made explicit the intention to end rent and eviction protection entirely. A promise which took giant steps towards realization in the Rent Regulation Reform Act of 1997. In cities nationwide, the consequences of urban renewal included the destruction of historical structures, the displacement of low-income families, and the removal of small businesses. Bigger circles represent cities where urban renewal displaced more people. In purple cities, the displaced was mostly people of color. In green cities, they were mostly white. Initially, support for the federal urban renewal program united business interests and housing reformers. Conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats. Ultimately, however, commercial development proved more attractive than low and middle income housing to most city leaders. These same officials would use urban renewal funds to destroy much of the city's stock of affordable housing. It's fucked up, y'all. Over the course of the program's life, federal officials approved over 13 billion grants to more than 1,200 cities, ranging in population size from a few thousand to several millions. Although there is no precise count of persons displaced or structures demolished, so they don't have an accurate number of the people displaced or the amount of units destroyed. We do know that hundreds of thousands of families lost their homes to urban renewal. State and federal highway constructions displaced hundreds of thousands of more people. So instead of using the federal funds to build affordable housing, they use the federal funds to build commercial structures. Finally, I want to say on urban renewal is that the Eurostat law was finally repealed last year. Now the city can make their own decisions in regard to rent regulations and creating zones for affordable housing.
First rezoning in 50 years. Mayor de Blasio was a major supporter of the plan, which will bring approximately 900 affordable housing units to the area. The rezoning plan passed with a vote of 43-5, but faces opposition from many people living in the neighborhood, along with the area's newly elected councilmen. Supporters say it will bring more diversity to two of the city's most historic neighborhoods.
So that video was just a news reporting of how when the city can decide, make decisions on their backyard, these are the things that can happen. They can redesign the zones that were created years ago, decades ago. And they can use ingenuity and policies to create affordable housing. So it was a good thing that the Eurostat law was repealed last year. It puts us in the right direction towards creating housing for the individuals or families that are displaced. The next critical factor that I would like to cover that contributes to the rise of homelessness in New York City is the deindustrialization of New York City. The lack of attention to poverty will prove to be a problem, as the number of manufacturing jobs, which have proved to be the engine for growth through the 1950s, began to decline in the 1960s. With little opportunity for good-paying jobs, more New Yorkers turned to public assistance as the industry left the city. The decline in manufacturing was particularly hard on the city's African-American community and recently arriving Puerto Rican population, who already were in the worst jobs, were often the first to be laid off and had the most difficulty in finding new employment. Recognizing that a particular segment of the population, especially the minority poor, were being excluded from America's post-war prosperity, President Johnson initiated the War on Poverty, part of an effort to bring about what he later referred to as the Great Society. Yet, the programs of the War on Poverty, as well as local politics in New York City, did little to reverse the broader economic trends that led manufacturing jobs to leave cities like New York. While the War on Poverty and related movements such as the welfare rights movement created new attitudes towards welfare and a new determination among minority groups, that the voices be heard within the halls of power, poverty, especially within neighborhoods, in the outer boroughs of the Bronx and Brooklyn remained deeply entrenched. By the 1970s, the state of these urban communities had reached a crisis level. They called it the War on Poverty. In his January 1964 State of Union address, President Lyndon B. Johnson dramatically declared unconditional war on poverty and called the programs to cure and prevent this widespread problem. In March, the administration sent to Congress legislation for the Economic Opportunity Act, whose variety of programs included the Jobs Corps, a job training program, volunteers in services to America, a public service program, and Head Start, a preschool program. The long and chaotic process of the disinstitutionalization in the United States consisted in handling over severely mentally ill patients from state clinics to local and community-based facilities. While it is true that the shift was a failure on many aspects, with patients losing health care, most of it was over by 1975, and those who wound up in the streets were often re-institutionalized one way or another, the lucky ones in nursing homes, others in jail. Mental health policy timeline. In 1946, President Truman signed the National Mental Health Act, calling for the establishment of the National Institute of Health to conduct research in neuropsychiatric problems. In 1963, President Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act to provide federal funding for the construction of community-based preventive care and treatment facilities. However, the program was never adequately funded due to the economic crisis and war. 1965. With the passage of Medicaid, states are incentivized to move patients out of the state mental hospitals and into nursing homes and general hospitals, since the program excluded coverage for people in institutions for mental disease. In 1967, the California legislatures passed the Landerman-Pestro Short Act, which makes involuntary hospitalization of mentally ill people vastly more difficult. Just 1 year after this law goes into effect, the number of mentally ill people in the criminal justice system doubles. That's critical, y'all. President Carter signed the mental health system in 1980, which aims to restructure the community mental health program and improve services for people with chronic mental health. That's a start. In 1981, under President Reagan, the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act repeals Carter's community health legislation and established block grants for states, ending federal government role in providing services to mentally ill. Federal mental health spending decreased by 30%. That's not good. In 2009, in the aftermath of the Great Recession, states are forced to cut $435 billion in public mental health spending over the next 3 years. This is the largest reduction in funding since the deinstitutionalization occurred. Pardon me, y'all. Present day, the parity law has been established under the Affordable Act. Murphy's is proposing the Helping Families with Mental Health Crisis Act to improve the quality of services and treatment. Now I want to move on to the next point. The next point is a huge legal case that ultimately reshaped how America, the deindustrialization of New York City and the deinstitutionalization. I'm talking about the Callahan legacy and how both of those together contributed legal rights to shelter. The rise of landmark victory in 1979 lawsuit Callahan versus Carey paved the way for further legal victories that ensured the right to shelter for homeless men, women, children, and families in New York City. The next point is a huge legal case that ultimately reshaped how America views homelessness. I'm talking about the Callahan legacy, Callahan versus Carey, and the legal rights to shelter. The landmark victory in 1979 lawsuit Callahan versus Carey paved the way for further legal victories that ensured the right to shelter for homeless men, women, children, and families in New York City. Robert Hayes, a 26-year-old graduate of New York University Law School, he decided to bring a class action suit on the basis of the constitutional provision that in the New York State Constitution passed as an amendment in 1938 at the urging of New York City's Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia reads. The aid, care, and support of the needy are public concerns, and shall be provided by the state and by such of its subdivision, and in such manner and by such means as the legislators may from time to time determine. All right, y'all. So Robert Hayes brought a lawsuit in 1979 against the governor at that time, Hugh L. Carey, on behalf of 3 homeless men who said the city had sometimes offered them no emergency accommodations and other times offered them only beds in the big room, a substandard overflow area in a former municipal shelter. The lead plaintiff in this case was Robert Callahan. Hayes cited legislative history from the 1938 Constitutional Convention to argue that the section was intended to confer rights to those who must look to society for bare necessity of life. The trial judge Andrew Tyler accepted evidence that during previous winters, homeless men had suffered loss of limbs from frostbites, that several had died, and that the coming winter would be worse because of the closing down of several shelters. August 26, 1981 recorded the state's obligation to provide food, shelter, supervision, and security to all homeless men applying, and set standards for shelters and emergency hotels accommodations for which the homeless were issued vouchers, including capacity limits, staff to residents ratio, and specifications regarding beds, bathroom facilities, and additional services such as mail, telephone, laundry, and secure storage, and also required the city to report regularly on the state of the shelter to the plaintiff's attorney. The plaintiff and defendant entered into a consent decree requiring New York City to furnish sufficient beds to meet the needs of every homeless man applying for shelter, provided that he qualifies on the basis of needs standards for relief and is in need of a temporary shelter by reason of physical, mental, or social dysfunction. The Callahan Decree also set minimum shelter standards regarding width and construction of shelter beds, the provision of supplies, and required that the city provide clear written information to shelter applicants concerning other public assistance to which they may be entitled. The trial judge maintains jurisdiction over the ongoing enforcement of the decree. The next big critical factor that I would like to talk about that contributed to the rise of homelessness is the crack era. In the United States during the 1980s, crack cocaine was popularized because of its affordability, its immediate euphoric effect, and its high profitability. And crack epidemic had a particularly devastating effect within the African American communities of the inner cities by causing the increase of addiction, death, and drug-related crimes. Crack cocaine first appeared in Miami, where Caribbean immigrants taught adolescents the technique of converting powdered cocaine into crack. The teenagers eventually introduced the business of producing and distributing crack cocaine to other major cities of the United States, including New York City, Detroit, and Los Angeles. In conclusion, the crack era contributed to the homelessness because it increased urban decay, brought down the value of building property, and it increased the amount of abandoned buildings, which became a refuge to sleep in and get high. Crack also increased homelessness because it added to the substance abuse problem. Substance abuse can destroy a person's morality, financial life, and personal life. In conclusion, the crack era contributed to the homelessness because it increased urban decay, brought down the value of building property, and it increased the amount of abandoned buildings, which became a refuge to sleep in and get high. Crack also increased homelessness because it added to the substance abuse problem. Substance abuse can destroy a person's morality, financial life, and personal life. Koch, Mayor David Dinkins, Mayor Giuliani, all to a certain extent were guided by the belief that providing permanent housing to shelter residents would only serve to draw more people to the shelter system. Before I get deeper, I just want to start off by saying that the rise in income inequality and the impact of the widening gap on the housing market is at the origin of modern homelessness. All right, y'all. Well, let's get started going back into how did the New York City mayors contribute to the rise of homelessness, starting with Mayor Koch. Mayor Koch was the first elected mayor of New York City in 1977, and he won re-election in 1981 with 75% of the votes. He was the first New York City mayor to win endorsements on both Democrat and Republican Party tickets. In 1985, Koch was elected to a third term with 78% of the vote. Now, Koch did set aside 10% of units created under his 10-year plan. He set aside $5 billion affordable housing for shelter residents. So that was one of the best things that he's done in his administration towards homelessness. Koch launched his landmark affordable housing program in 1986, resulting in a significant reduction in New York City's homeless population and creating 15,000 housing units for homeless people. Koch's case on behalf of families for whom the city had proved insufficient shelter. All right, let's go a little further into the Mayor Koch administration. In 1986, Koch and McCain versus Koch decided May 13, 1986. This court held that the homeless families with children are entitled to emergency shelter on both constitutional and statutory grounds, and a preliminary injunction was granted prohibiting a denial of such shelters to eligible homeless families. This case in 1986 went to the appellate division of the state Supreme Court in Manhattan, ruled that the New York City could not deny emergency shelter for homeless families with children. Previous cases had established the right of the single homeless men and women to shelter. In that ruling, the appellate court said that thousands of children were subject to inevitable emotional scarring because of the failure of the city and state officials to provide emergency shelter. Yvonne McCain, a once homeless mother of 4 whose years of living in a fetid, ramshack welfare hotel in Midtown Manhattan led to a landmark court ruling requiring the city to provide decent shelter for homeless families. She is considered a hero in the history of fighting for homeless rights. Mayor Koch ordered a new campaign to remove homeless people from the streets on freezing nights this winter and take them to shelters or hospitals, whether or not they were willing to go. Former Mayor Koch created a problem of forcing thousands of homeless families and cramming them into barrack-style shelters and ramshack welfare hotels. The next slide is a news reporting in 1989 during Koch administration. Former Mayor Koch also had to deal with quote-unquote the mole people.
Too near the main floor and the cops will find you and throw you on the streets. Too far from help and you may get robbed and beaten by other homeless residents of the terminal. A good home can't be found by others. A good home is far enough from the steam pipe so that its residents can breathe. That's a good home, but there's only one nicest home in Grand Central Station. To find the nicest home in Grand Central Station, you have to walk down a lot of stairs. If you go early enough, all you'll see is the occasional sign of people who have slept on the stairwell. But if you go late, those people will be there in person, rarely moving, covered in filthy blankets with moldy food just inches away. More tempting for the rats, really, than the hungry. You step around them as you descend, and when the stairs end, you come to a ladder. In the nicest home in Grand Central Station, you have to step gingerly. A wrong step like I made, and you end up in a hole that could have meant a bad fall. Thanks to the man who lives here, I only scraped up my hand and ankle a little. You have made a home here.
Right.
Why?
I look at it like this: we're homeless, but we ain't hopeless.
Much of the area beneath Grand Central Station is uncomfortably warm, even in the dead of winter. But here there is a breeze that seems to come from nowhere and makes it far more livable. Because it's so isolated, the couple who lives here spreads their possessions out. Books and magazines, a change of clothes, even extra shoes. They don't have to worry about other homeless stealing their stuff because they wouldn't be able to find it. They even hooked up an electric light to read by. The couple used to sleep in a stairwell, but it wasn't safe.
We used to sleep down there, but then the police kept coming down, and they would make everybody move out. So we got so tired of the police bugging us. So we built a little ladder, and I came up here and I checked it out.
The two people who live in the nicest home in Grand Central Station take showers each day at a nearby shelter, and they eat at soup kitchens and work hard at taking care of themselves in a civilized manner. And they have little sympathy for those who don't.
They have dirty clothes, but you can always go to a church, and the church will give you some clothes. You take the dirty clothes, you can wash your clothes, because soap doesn't cost neither. Soap and water doesn't cost. If you wanted to get yourself together, niggas, long story short, life is what you make it.
And what he has made for himself here is a home, the nicest home in Grand Central Station, insulated with warmth and security. But not only security from you, though, I would guess, right?
No, security from the other people in the area, too.
Yeah. They are, in at least that sense, victims of one another.
Oh, yes, all the time.
Still, it's a common complaint of the residents of Grand Central, the way they're treated by the cops. Police have been sanctioned for their behavior, but those who live here say it continues without interruption.
You wouldn't want to catch an elevator ride, because point blank, I'm telling you like this, brother. They try to up, just like they tried to do me the other day.
So, afraid of the cops and afraid of each other, many homeless stick to themselves, because making friends at Grand Central Station can be a dangerous business.
They'll take them in the back trucks and they'll use them. And they'll only get what they want from them. As soon as they're done, they'll either beat them up so bad that the girl don't want to talk to nobody, or she just don't want to talk because she's too scared to talk.
It is the first of many unpleasant realities newly homeless people confront. The streets are a constantly violent world where you must always fear, ironically, those closest to you. Tomorrow we'll take a look at how these people who spend their nights underground spend their days, and why they have created for themselves a world as foreign to us as a faraway country. It is a defense, and when we descend the stairs tomorrow, we will be on their turf, where they make the rules. Ernie,
That'll be interesting to see. Thank you, Jim. Coming up next here, experts say American youngsters are far behind in math and science. We have a special report on what you can do to help your children.
Also, in sports, the Knicks try to extend their home winning streak to
the mole people. And tonight, Jim Dolan reports live for us from Grand Central with part 3 of a special report. Jim.
Ernie, if you have to commute through here every day, you probably think you know this grand old building pretty well. But what you probably know is the main floor and maybe one floor below. You know where to catch your train and where to get a cab if you need one. But if you want to learn about the people who live in Grand Central Station, well, that's a different story. That's a dangerous job. First, you have to wait till about 1:30 in the morning when this station closes, and then you have to walk down a lot of stairs. You have to walk through the shadows and get lost in the tunnels. You won't see anyone at all at first until you learn where to look and what signs to look for. Look fast if you want to see the residents of the maze beneath Grand Central Station. They are shadows and then a face that quickly disappears. They are phantoms whose backs you might catch for a moment, but who will soon be gone.
He worked his way through a maze to get in there. It's a sense of security for him. I would have to crawl through the pipes myself to get at him.
No, it's not likely they'll be caught down here. This is not our world here, nor the world of the cops. Here we are on their turf, invading their homes, and it will be morning rush hour before they ascend to a world we know.
They'll come back in the morning. They hand out a lot of free meals around, so that brings them out.
These miles of pipes down here beneath Grand Central Station provide the steam not only for Grand Central, but for a number of the adjoining buildings. It's extremely hot in here, well over 100 degrees, and often when the police come down here and they find people, they also find slabs of meat on the pipe. This is where the homeless, the people who live down here, cook their food. Those who are caught down here, 3 levels beneath the station floor, are often found nude because the heat creates a steam bath for anyone who spends any time here. It is a spooky world they inhabit, with few even dreaming of getting out. During the day, they must fear the police who would put them out on the streets, but after the station closes its doors at about 1:30 in the morning and the police finish their rounds, they need only worry about each other.
There's a bunch of crackheads sitting there doing their rock.
Crackheads, those who do crack or rock, they are one of the biggest fears of those who don't do drugs and one of the biggest reasons for homelessness. For those who need the drug, a home becomes an unaffordable luxury, and Grand Central Station offers at least the illusion of a safe haven.
Some people out here can go home, but they don't want to. Then you got a lot of people out here like me.
Why don't they want to?
Because they want to sit
Because
there.
they're out here smoking that shit.
And also, and I'll tell you a reason why. Because I have a friend and he told me the reason he lives on the street and he's doing crack. Free rent, free food, ain't got to worry about nothing, ain't got to worry about
crack.
More money for crack.
As they stand and talk, the residents of the tunnels seem to treat one another with only passing regard. Notice the sleeping man behind us under the stairway. Those sleeping are little more than pieces of furniture to step around by those who can't yet sleep. And when the people I'm talking with have found their space in the tunnels, they'll be stepped around too. And when morning comes, they'll be back upstairs and on the streets.
You know, you're stranded to the situation, you know what I mean? You know, either you have a choice. You either panhandle and somebody helps you out, just like she was saying, somebody helps you out, or either you just say, hey, this is it, and just lay down and die.
Well, in some ways, many of the people already have decided to just lay down and die. You can panhandle for money here, and drugs are easy to find on the main floor. But hope is the one thing in precious short supply on the main floor at Grand Central Station. Tomorrow, we'll leave this building and explore some of the city's subway stations and meet some of the people who call those places home. And we'll meet a woman who nearly lost her life when a homeless man tried to set her and the place she worked on fire. That's tomorrow night. Arnie, Kaidi?
Jim, thank you. Next, Dwight Gooden becomes the highest paid player in baseball.
Also, the Knicks try to work their winning ways in Atlanta. Corey McFerrin has all the sports when we continue.
Another thing that contributed to homelessness during Mayor Koch's administration was Black Monday. On October 19, 1987, the stock market crashed in Wall Street. This brought the city into a deep recession. Many financial corporate people committed suicide or went into poverty. Mayor Koch's best laid plans were hampered by a crippled economy and a community backlash. The next mayor I would like to talk about is Mayor David Dinkins. When David Dinkins ran for mayor in 1989, he set forth an ambitious plan to change the way the city dealt with homeless families. Homelessness, he argued, was basically a housing problem, one that could be solved by rapidly relocating families from shelters and welfare hotels into permanent housing. Within months of Dinkins' election, however, it became clear that the approach was not working. Over the next few years, the administration slowly and reluctantly abandoned the views about homelessness that Dinkins had confidently asserted in the campaign. The blueprint for the new administration homeless policy had been prepared in March 1987 by a task force that Dinkins, then Mayor Manhattan Borough President, appointed. Its report, entitled "A Shelter is Not a Home," defined family homelessness in narrowly economic terms and argued that the solution was to provide more permanent housing. Since the report's author thought the private market incapable of supplying affordable housing, the city itself would have to do the job. The Dinkins Task Force called on the city to increase its production of rehabilitated apartments for homeless families to 8,000 per year. The Dinkins proposal assumed that doubling the supply of city-provided permanent housing would not stimulate demand for temporary shelter. In a section of its report entitled "Myths and Facts About Homeless Families," the task force criticized what it called myths. Families with other housing options voluntarily enters the shelter system in order to upgrade their housing at the public's expense and get priority for rehabilitated permanent housing. Fact, there's little evidence that families forsake stable housing arrangements hoping to get an apartment through the city. The report pointed out that although the number of families sheltered by the city had grown steadily during the mid-1980s, from 1,153 in January of 1983 to 4,365 in September of 1986. The number of families requesting shelter each month did not rise. There is no indication that the availability of emergency housing has produced an increase in demand for shelter or an increase in homelessness, the report stated. The task force concluded that the growth of family homelessness resulted from far too few shelter system families moving out to permanent housing, not from too many marginal house families moving into the shelter system. When Mayor David Dinkins took office in 1990, his administration put its ideas to the test. The mayor appointed Nancy Waxstein, an advocate with the Citizens Committee for Children who had served on the staff of his task force, to head the mayor's office on homelessness and SRO housing. Under her direction, the city vastly increased the supply of permanent housing for homeless families and continued a Koch administration initiative to give homeless families priority for vacant public housing units. The results were disappointing. The Dinkins administration hoped to take advantage of the increased supply of permanent housing to put an immediate end to the use of welfare hotels, which were already being phased out. But unlike Koch, Dinkins was unable or unwilling to move hotel families into less desirable accommodations to await permanent housing. Further, in May of 1990, the City Council had enacted legislations to phase out the use of Tier 1 shelters by June 1992. He thought that he could get people into permanent housing instead of going into hotels. Remember years ago, the family shelters went from gym-like beddings where everyone had a cot, even if you were a family and had to sleep in open space. But they started to put families into hotels, and the hotels were horrible to separate them from the rest. So it was like he wanted to get people into housing instead of going into hotels, and he felt they shouldn't go to crappy hotels to wait for housing. If you remember anything or heard about hotels back then, it was horrible. By some indication, the new strategy seemed to be working. As of July 1990, only 147 families remained in the infamous welfare hotels, compared to with 3,306 families when Koch was in office. The Alternative Pathway Program, APP, implemented in October of 1990. Under APP, some of the HPD apartments that would otherwise go to shelter system families were instead made available to families double up in private apartments. The city explained that the program would give double up families an incentive to stay out of the shelters by convincing them that they had a chance of getting their own apartment. It is doubtful that APP has been effective as a reward for double-up families to stay put, because families enrolled in APP are assigned apartments by lottery. They cannot be certain of getting their own apartment. By contrast, all families entering the shelter system are still assured of an eventual transfer to permanent housing. Housing tenants resented the preferential treatment according to homeless families. In 1990, housing authority projects were home to some 100,000 members of families double up in housing authority units, in addition to their 470,000 authorized residents. These double up residents were eager to apply for housing vacancies, but found that none would be available until SRT had filled its quotas for homeless referrals. Housing authority tenants did not take kindly to seeing their own internal homeless pushed to the back of the line. By 1990, tenants had become so frustrated that they had held public demonstrations protesting the expedited placement of homeless families in public housing. It was only a matter of time before housing authority officials would side with their tenants, partially as a means of strengthening their own hand in the inter-bureaucratic struggles over responsibilities for the homeless. The resistance to homeless families among public housing tenants likely came as a surprise to the Dinkins administration. A shelter's not a home had attacked Myth 13, No community wants housing for the homeless in its own backyard. Fact, communities have accepted housing for the homeless when the facilities are small scale, well supervised by an accountable nonprofit organization, priorities given to homeless people from the same area, and advanced planning included local input. Because of these problems, the Housing Authority has reduced its efforts to place homeless families in the summer of 1991. The command center abandoned its practice of warehousing vacant apartments for the homeless. In June 1992, Hernandez Pinero abolished the SRT. Homeless family applying for vacancies in public housing are now subject to the same eligibility review as everyone else. Although it is true that some families become homeless for economic reasons, the result of the efforts to place them in public housing undermine the assumption that problems is primarily economic. This assumption is implicit in the word homeless itself, which is in contrast with terms like underclass stresses the economic aspect of homelessness and diminishes the behavior and social aspects, as Waxstein observed in July 1992. Homelessness is a useless word because it describes so many different kinds of people with different problems. A crack abusing young man on the streets has different problems than a mentally ill alcoholic in a flop house than a teenage mother on welfare. The Dinkins administration realized early on that its approach to homelessness was not working. As a response, in September 1991, Mayor Dinkins farmed out the job of rethinking homeless policy to a commission on the homeless headed by Andrew Cuomo, the governor's son, and now an assistant secretary of housing and urban development. In February 1992, the commission released its report, The Way Home, a new direction in social policy, which refuted the assumption that they had guided the early Dinkins policy. The commission forthrightly acknowledged that placing thousands of homeless families into permanent housing contributed to an enormous surge of families entering the shelter system. It also acknowledged that behavior problems were an important cause of homelessness. Mayor Dinkins and some of his top administrators deserve considerable credit for facing up to the truth that they had pursued a wrong-headed policy. They have acknowledged that perverse incentives and behavior problems are central to the problems of family homelessness, and the Cuomo Commission had developed a detailed plan for reform.
All right, you just heard Christine Quinn talk about the difference between how de Blasio and Giuliani handled the homeless populations, and she, for one, criticized Giuliani's move them along approach. I want to bring in our panel to talk about that and more. Jeannie Zaino, professor of political science at Iona College, also professor of campaign management at NYU. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, who's also filed a series recently on this very issue. Scott Vanderhoff's an attorney and a former 5-term Rockland County executive. And Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. And let's first do with the two different approaches. And I think the two former mayors pretty clear on this. When you were there, you saw Rudy's approach. He said it again in a recent piece, move them along. He also said, they're all God's children, but at the same point, he said, make life as uncomfortable form as possible so they won't stay on the streets if they don't get help. And if we got to move them out of the city, that's a good thing. De Blasio first said there wasn't a problem. Then he said the media was, making this a mountain out of molehill. Then he acknowledged it was a crisis. And he's trying to do things, I guess, in a more traditionally progressive way. How about the two different approaches?
Giuliani, it depends on who you're talking to. Giuliani's approach, to some degree, was effective if you define dealing with the homeless problem as out of sight, out of mind. You're not going to see them on the subways. It is a major problem, a quality of life problem for de Blasio, because it just seems like there's a homeless explosion now where you see them everywhere on the subway, meaning homeless people. The K2 effect, the synthetic marijuana. I just want to say this, Richard, quickly about Speaker Quinn. She was one of the first speakers to have a renewed commitment to women and children, and she put her money where her mouth was in terms of budget dollars to help women in all types of situations. There are only two stories that I have to disassociate myself from. I cannot, on a human level, cover the funeral of a child. I cannot cope personally looking at the small coffins. And it was very hard working on this homeless series because I'm talking to a woman that looks like you, Professor, or any other woman, and she's telling me a story of how bad luck happened to hit upon her, and in the next room is her 8-year-old daughter. And it's a vicious cycle. And all I could think of was the daughter, and I had to remove myself because she's telling me that at 2 o'clock in the morning, as you just said, she's at the center in the Bronx, and they're just busing her to a hotel where she's got to check out at 6:30 in the morning. Now, how is your child supposed to go to school in that situation? 8 years old. It's repeating the cycle all over again.
And I put a mayor in between, which was Bloomberg, and a lot of people say that the change in the funding structure made it harder to find more quasi-permanent places to put these folks because it made it harder. But it also lended to a different debate. And that is one that we've had here before, which was if you make programs or landing spots for this population, Andrew, more appealing. In fact, Bill O'Reilly, our friend, said you're only going to encourage more folks to go in there. If you make the safety net too cushy, I guess was the analogy, you're going to try and create a bigger population or disincentivize them to leave that hammock. What do you think?
I think we have this debate about a lot of different safety net issues, whether it's welfare or in this case, homelessness. And I think Dominic hit on the key of this issue, which is, what's your goal for success here? Is it not seeing them? Because if that's the case, then the Giuliani approach of just forcing everybody via the police into shelters or out of the city is the right answer, because that's the easiest way to not see them anymore. But that doesn't, to my mind, actually address the issue. And it doesn't help the people who are the victims of this to figure out a way to change their lives and give them access to the tools where they just won't be homeless. It's just that we won't see it anymore. And I think it's somewhat disingenuous. I mean, I think it's really sweeping it under the rug or out of sight, out of mind. And I don't think that helps anybody in the long run.
And also, I would think, Scott, that it's really hard to throw a blanket over this like it's one big problem. I mean, you were a county executive, but you had everything from suburban, obviously, areas, in a bedroom community in New York City. You had some cities within your county, and also you had more rural areas. But you have the mentally ill that are part of this population. You have the women and children that are part of this. You have people that have substance abuse you have people that are veterans that are making up a good size and bigger than national average in terms of it. what's the hidden part of the story that people who don't have to deal with it don't really realize?
Well, you're right. I mean, homelessness is everywhere, including the suburbs. So you have to have the heart of Christine Quinn and the policies of Rudy Giuliani to make it work. Because you are immediately sympathetic to somebody who doesn't have a place to go. But the public sidewalks are not a bedroom. And so you deal with the issue of where is the housing. Okay, and I've talked about this. So one of the things de Blasio finally came around on is actually providing more money for legal aid, for example, more money for lawyers to help those who might be evicted to become homeless.
And people didn't understand that, but they just saw the headline, he's paying for more attorneys. Those attorneys were basically acting as advocates to try and get these people to get through the bureaucracy to have a roof over their
That's
head.
correct. What they often did was would fight landlords or fight situations to provide some help to those who are about to be evicted, or it's on some cases unnecessarily roughed up by landlords for one reason or another. And of course, this is where this fine policy difference is. You can't just do it all by heart. These folks need some place to go, and they can't use the sidewalks. And so it does matter that they're not on the sidewalks. It matters as a matter of the lifestyle that New Yorkers want, and also the whole idea of trying to be, I think, sympathetic and comforting to those who need housing. But you need to deal with housing. And the one thing she said I thought was particularly good. This is a multi-pronged problem, which requires all sorts of different kinds of answers. One on the mentally ill, one on the housing issue, one on the use of drugs, and each of these issues is different. But you can't just let them sleep on the streets.
And it comes back again, for this mayor, fairly or not, to politically how he handled it and how he's handling it now. It seems like he's got his sea legs on the issue, but for the beginning, he was caught off guard in the beginning. I think his position came off as tone deaf to many who saw a different reality than the one that he was seeing, even if the data was the same. But he does finally seem to be getting his act together on this. Fair?
I think he does, and I think this is a problem that Mayor de Blasio has had all along. You know, he is the leading progressive mayor in the country, if not the world. And what I think he needs to do is to show that progressives can govern a city safely and effectively. And so what are the policies you put in place to do that? That's what he's got to show. And so to deny that there's a homeless problem, I think was hugely problematic, and every thinking person who walked down the street knew that was a problem. And yet I do agree he's gotten better about admitting there's a problem. I'm not so sure we're seeing the policies in terms of how you deal with this, because let's not forget, one of the big questions is, can a progressive Democrat safely and effectively govern a city? He's supposed to show us that that can happen. Well, what are the policies you put in place to do that? And I don't know that anybody around this table can say, here are the 2, 3, 4, 5 things that you need to do. There's no answers there. And so,
and what's funny is nobody thinks that the problem was created under his administration,
no,
but denying its existence in the beginning all of a sudden made it his issue instead of saying, look what I got handed by my predecessor.
But he said, I'm going to be the progressive mayor and I'm going to handle these problems. And then you need to show how policy-wise you do that, not just for New York, but for the rest of the country.
Well, in fact, he's in Washington now at another progressive national conference. So when we come back, the Republican Party has declared war on Planned Parenthood. In fact, it was issued front and center in our nation's capital today. We'll take you inside the Capitol Hill hearings this afternoon and show you why this fight may be one that the grand old party cannot win.
A major piece of investigative journalism over a year in the making played out on the front pages of the New York Times this week. The series, The Invisible Child, brought Dasani, a 12-year-old homeless girl on the streets of New York City, to life. Meet Dasani.
This is Dasani, named after the bottled water because to her mother it signified luxury. She's a proud 4-foot 8-inch tall 12-year-old and one in an invisible army of children, 22,000 strong, who are homeless in New York City. And this is what passes for a home, a 520 square foot room shared with her parents and 7 siblings in a dilapidated city-run shelter.
I am going to college.
School is where Dasani can find an escape, learning to recite poems from memory.
Phenomenal Woman by Maya Angelou.
Pretty Woman wonders where my secret lies. I'm not you, a built a suit, a fashion model style.
Despite her tough circumstances, Dasani has boundless energy. She dreams big, but even her dreams are clouded by the despair that surrounds her.
In your imagination, what does the perfect childhood look like?
Quiet, flowers everywhere, sparkles on the ground. Mom and Dad always talked of a perfect childhood. Yeah, Mom and Dad can be drunk at a perfect childhood.
So you think that being drunk is a part of the perfect childhood? The parents are drunk?
Yes, because when they're drunk, you ask for anything, they tell you can get it. That's a perfect childhood.
Really, Dasani, you really think a perfect childhood is your parents?
You said use my imagination.
Okay.
I used it.
That voice you heard on the tape with Dasani was Andrea Elliott, the New York Times reporter who spent 15 months chronicling this family's struggle. And Andrea joins us now. I have to say, an extraordinary piece of journalism, maybe the most remarkable thing I have read this year.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. And Dasani, one of 22,000 homeless children in the city of New York, but a remarkable young girl.
She is. She's a remarkable girl. I would argue that her circumstances are less remarkable because of the sheer size of this population. But this kid is curious, funny, whip smart. Her resilience was something that I really was curious about myself, how strength played a role in getting her through her day-to-day life.
And grown up. I mean, she's 11 years old for most of the time you spent with her. And yet she's kind of a surrogate parent.
She is, very much so. And one of the things I think I came away with after spending a year, more than a year with this family, was just seeing how the very qualities that potentially could help her escape her circumstances, her strength, her resilience, her intelligence, are also things that have become indispensable to carrying the family forward, in a sense. She's relied upon to hold it together because this is a family that struggles with a lot of problems, and so it's a little bit the irony of her strengths in the way that they become a weakness.
And you talk about how that number caught your eye, 22,000 homeless children. This is, to put it in context, they couldn't all fit in Madison Square Garden.
Right.
And yet this is the invisible side of homelessness. We don't see these children as much.
It's true. I find it really striking how when I was with them, kind of just in their daily lives in New York City, how easily they remain on the margins and sort of in the shadows of city life. And part of that has to do with the fact that I think the experience of poverty in the United States is one that is more subtle than in other places I've covered. And so in New York City, a lot of the garments, for instance, clothing garments that are donated that find their way to this family come from households of means. So the children will be wearing used Uggs and Patagonia fleeces, and you just poverty doesn't wear itself in such an obvious way. And yet, what I think that the family would say about that is that it makes it no more superior than poverty in other countries when you consider the incredible gap between what these children have and what they need in order to thrive. This child, Dasani, and her siblings, is really gifted. She's an amazing athlete. She's a great dancer. She's really, really smart. Had she been born into other circumstances, she would be thriving. But in her life as it is, she's merely surviving.
And describe the conditions, because you saw something none of us ever get a chance to see, because frankly, we're not allowed inside. Describe the circumstances inside a family homeless shelter. This is some 300 people living in this shelter.
So this is a shelter that is run by the city, and most shelters in New York City are actually run by nonprofits. There's a range of experiences, but this shelter is definitely one that struggles with a lot of terrible conditions, in the sense that there's mold on the walls, mice in their room. They were laying out traps every night and shooting video of the mice that they would catch. They had to hang their food from a plastic bag from the ceiling. The food was served rancid a lot of the time. Two of the children are asthmatic, one is legally blind, and they shared this small space with 10 people basically doubled up on mattresses in one small space for years. And I think that kind of compressed experience of living would make any family fall apart. And
I mean, incredible, and the photographs are, I mean, really bring it to light. But you're a mom. You've got two young children. This is not like any really other story, right? How this had to affect you, especially a year, 15 months.
It very much opened my eyes, as also a New Yorker, to a different experience of the city. And this is kind of what I came away with again and again, was just the sense that while New York is very much a place defined by what's out of reach, I mean, it's impossible. Most people feel that there's something out of reach when they're living in New York, an apartment they can't get or a job. But this is a population for whom everything is out of reach. And I think that is what struck me the most, being with these children day in, day out, and just thinking about how that experience is replicated tens of thousands of times in this homeless population, but also by millions across the country. This sense that this is a country that is filled with promise that isn't for them, that isn't something that's attainable by them.
And just, we're almost out of time, but I can't imagine you're going to leave this story behind. I mean, I could tell from watching that tape, you've almost become a mentor to Dasani. You're not only chronicling her life, but you've become close to this girl and her family.
I remain a journalist. My role is as a journalist. The reporting, when you're reporting on children, it's a very different thing. You really do have to connect with them and talk about their feelings and their experiences in a way that draws them out. And she's a very vocal child. I hope to continue to follow them, yes.
All right, Andrea Elliott, again, an extraordinary piece of journalism and a really important one. Thank you for taking the time to share it with us.
Thank you.
Disturbing new video tonight from inside a city homeless shelter. Also, a man who says he was beaten for complaining about the conditions. Both could be seen as reasons why many homeless people won't set foot in shelters. CBS 2's Tracy Carrasco has more.
This homeless encampment on West 38th Street in Midtown Manhattan, significantly smaller from these photos earlier this month, but still overtaking this neighborhood, according to residents.
It just kept growing and growing, and then now you're seeing like 10 people there.
Chairs, suitcases, boxes, and even a woman using the restroom on the street. Some say they're here because it's their only option.
But they always keep telling you, well, we still looking for a place for you. We're going to try to put you in a two-man apartment. They go on and on with this. I told you I was out here since the winter.
Or because the streets are better than the alternative.
Safe in the streets, yeah. I got family out here. You know what I mean? I don't like shelters because I got beat up too many times.
They all agree and say they're not rushing into shelters like this. Dirty toilets, broken tiles, garbage-strewn facilities documented at the New Dawn homeless shelter in Harlem. A hard sell for outreach workers trying to convince them to enter city shelters.
Bad plumbing, elevator service always breaks down, mold everywhere, roaches, mice.
On Tuesday, CBS 2's Marsha Kramer asked Mayor de Blasio about claims that shelter workers beat up a resident trying to expose the problem.
I wonder what you'd like to do about that shelter.
I had not heard that case, and obviously if that's true, I'm very, very concerned. You're absolutely right. There are other shelters that are not acceptable.
According to Robert Miscali, former Deputy Commissioner of Homeless Services, last month the outreach program had a success rate of less than 1%.
There's no real remedy for homelessness, not at all.
Mayor de Blasio says he's working to create a new reality where the homeless will feel confident going into shelters, and that next month officials will re-release a report explaining the difficulties about getting people into shelters and make recommendations on how to do a better job. Reporting from Midtown Manhattan, Tracy Carrasco, CBS 2 News.
And Human Resources Commissioner Steve Banks told CBS 2 the agency has hired a new group to run the New Dawn shelter and that it will, quote, address conditions that have built up over many years.
Homelessness is a complex, multifaceted problem, and it requires a complex set of rules to respond to it. There's no single solution to homelessness. Stop, repeal the Charles Forest law. Have a national livable. This was already done in 2019. Link property tax to the changes in the national minimum wages. Repeal the Charles Eurostat law. But this was already done in 2019. State hospitals must return to the traditional roles of the hospital of last resort. They must function as entry points to the mental health system for most people with severe mental illness, who otherwise will end up in jail or in prison. State hospitals are also necessary for involuntary commitment. We cannot depend on our current outpatient facilities to provide the support that is necessary to prevent unnecessary homelessness or admission to jails or prison. Among the most voluntary people with severe mental health illness, more housing with various degrees of supervision and facilities with a full range of services must be brought back into the mental health system, along with revised laws for access to those services to appropriately care for this population. Properly evaluate every homeless intake in an assessment shelter, roughly into two categories: those that are functional and those that are low functioning. Then create more SROs, different ones for mental ill patients, hoarders, substance abuse, elderly, physical disabilities, domestic violence individuals, foster care individuals, transgender, anybody out of jail. Create different SROs for each category, and even for the high functioning individuals and for families. Create vouchers for each type of SROs. The mentally ill get a particular voucher, the elderly get a particular voucher, people with foster care get a particular voucher, people with physical disability get a different voucher, get a particular voucher, and people with mentally ill get a particular voucher. Then create a database in which landlords are incentivized to list an available unit of their property that they are willing to lease to a person with a voucher. The landlord can select or be aware of which individual they are renting to by the voucher. Housing specialists should be given incentivized to connecting clients with a housing voucher to a landlord. The database can also directly help clients because it will make it easier for them to find housing without relying heavily on the market brokers or the housing specialists. Also, the city should build more buildings dedicated for different SROs. These new buildings should be included in the database for high functioning individuals to search. There needs to be a better screening process. Every displaced individual should be characterized as either high functioning or low functioning. Every high functioning individual should not be at a shelter. Shelters should be for low functioning individuals that cannot take care of themselves. Placing high functioning individuals in SROs as opposed to shelters will give them a better sense of being an individual that could lead to a better state of mind. There needs to be a better screening process. Every displaced individual should be characterized as either high functioning or low functioning. Every high-functioning individual should not be at a shelter. Shelters should be for low-functioning individuals that cannot take care of themselves. Placing high-functioning individuals in SROs as opposed to shelters will give them a better sense of being an individual that could lead to a better state of mind. Increase the housing voucher to or above market level. In each SRO building, schedule job orientation weekly at the common areas or recreational areas. Build homes on empty lots for individuals with animals. For low-functioning individuals, like former mole people, provide outreach specifically to help them. Launch a street outreach team that is dedicated or assigned to discouraging homeless people from sleeping on trains and train station platforms. Assign or hire more caseworkers for each client. Shelter staff are overworked and underpaid, so their pay should increase. Working with a low morale can lead to being unwilling to give shelter residents the care they need. This forces residents to take matters into their own hands. Possibly make annual training for shelter staff to refresh their sensitivity and training. Make affordable housing affordable. Thank you for participating, man.
You're welcome.
All right. My first question that I wanted to ask you is, how long you been in the system?
I've been in the system since October the 16th.
Got you. Of 2020?
No, maybe about 45, 46 days.
Oh. And the second question I wanted to ask you was, sorry, you want to pick that? Yeah, and sorry about that.
It's okay.
Second question I wanted to ask you was, what are the challenges you face finding housing?
Okay, right now I'm trying to get the voucher. They say you have to be here 90 days. So after I establish the voucher, then I'm going to start the battle with trying to find housing. Now, one of the things I hear a lot of other people say is that it's taking them a little too long, more than 90 days, and some people been here a year or a little longer.
Yeah.
But for myself, I know that I'm going to do everything that I need to do to be in compliance, and then I'm going to look for housing on my own also.
That's what's up. That's what's up. God willing too. My last question I wanted to say is, what changes you think need to happen in the shelter facility or the whole system in general?
Okay. One of the biggest challenges that I see is that the Office of Mental Health, they don't have places for individuals that really suffer with real mental health issues. So they end up in the shelter, they end up in prisons. And when you get them in the shelter, they're non-compliant in their medication, they act out, and it makes it an environment where you have to really be on point because you don't know what these individuals are doing. My suggestions is that the Office of Mental Health place a person in each one of the shelters so that they can work with the people on being medication compliant. This way they won't decompensate and you won't have a whole bunch of nonsense.
Absolutely. Yo, thank you.
Make it a safer place.
Thank you, man.
You're welcome.
Yo, I want to say thank you for your time and thank you and good luck.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Yo, I just want to say thank you again for participating, Chief.
You're ready, man.
No doubt. First question I want to ask you, man, is how long you been in the system?
In the shelter?
Yeah.
I've been in here going on, I'm a young buck, I've been in here like 6 months now going on, but it feels like 12, you know?
Yeah.
And through that little bit of time, I've seen a lot, you know? How it's working and how the system is not good in here, man.
Can I ask you, my second question I wanted to ask you is, what challenges you think people face trying to find housing? Like, is it... Shut the hell up, man. Good.
It's real hard in here, man. You got brothers in here 2 years, man. I got roommates in here 3 years, a year, but it's all on who's different strokes, different folks. But at the same reality, it ain't these guys' fault either, man. It's the system, man. Because I've been here long enough, and I'm going through the 2-year, 3-year crisis that they going through. Like going on with the food. The food is terrible.
The vouchers.
People sneaking in food just to eat for the night. The vouchers ain't right, you know what I mean? You wait for so long, they tell you to save your money to help you get your joint, but the vouchers ain't even combining and connect with the righteous joint. And then how they got people in here, you got the segregation of different people, you got sight people with normal people.
That's damn.
You know what I mean? You got working people with people, homeless people that don't have jobs, so it's not even an iron.
Yo, that's not right with you.
It's raw, man.
It's not organized what you just said.
It's not organized. So I'm in a room with working people. I'm a working dude. I come in, work, go to work. So when I go to sleep, I see it's different type people in my room that's not even workers, man. And they not even, you know, it's just wrong in here, man, you know?
Yo, I want to say thank you again for participating. And people, the people that sheltered, that's not out there, they're gonna know about what you just said, and it's gonna be some changes because the shit can't.
Different shelters in there that runs different, man. This shelter I'm in, I see what I go through. It's a lot of people in here, man. It's good people, man, but it's the system, man. They all about to check, got work, get a staff, all that. Even security, man. But you're a real guard, man.
Yo, you feel respect?
Real shit.
Whether they give it to you or not, right?
It's real shit, man. Real shit, man.
Yo, I want to say thank you, man, and much love to you. It's going to be a change.
Fuck with you, man. I hope this is...
All right, Mr. Tyrone, first question that I wanted to ask you is, how long have you been working in this field?
It's going on approximately 16 years.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
My second question is, because you are a housing specialist, right?
Yeah.
Second question is, what challenges do you think clients face finding housing?
The resources. A lot of the problems is that there's not a lot of resources for them to actually go find an apartment. They have the vouchers there for them, the money to pay for these apartments, but they don't have the actual apartments available in New York City because everything is saturated.
Damn.
Yeah.
And my last question is, before I end, is what changes you think should be implemented, in your opinion?
I think overall they should have more available housing within the city. Like this is a city that's generated by money, and there's a lot of big corporations throughout New York. There's a lot of people that own a lot of property. There are all these luxury apartment buildings all through the city. They should at least, have a fraction of those apartment buildings allocated for the people that are in the shelter so they can have somewhere to live, opposed to giving the wealthy these nice luxury apartments that they have up.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tyrone.
No problem.
Just want to say thank you for watching the video. I hope it can open up people's minds, induce a change. I just want to make a shout out to everybody who helped me with this video. When you see a homeless person on the street, hope it can if you have it within your heart, show a little love. Homelessness can happen to anybody. And always try to stay informed. Make sure you vote for the right politician with the right policy. And also keep hope alive. Just want to say thank you for watching the video. I hope it can open up people's minds, induce a change. I just want to make a shout out to everybody who helped me with this video. When you see a homeless person on the street, hope it can try to, if you have it within your heart, show a little love. Homelessness can happen to anybody. And always try to stay informed. Make sure you vote for the right politician with the right policy. And also keep hope alive.